The courtroom was silent. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The man in the defendant's chair sat with a smug smile on his face, confident that he would walk free. His suit was crisp, his hair slicked back, and his dark eyes scanned the room like he was already celebrating. Then, the little boy stood up. 8-year-old Noah Harper stepped forward, his small hands clenched at his sides. His big, round eyes darted across the room before locking onto the man sitting just feet away from him, the same man who had stolen his mother from him. Everyone thought this trial was over. Everyone believed there wasn't enough evidence to convict. But Noah knew something that no one else did. His heart pounded so hard in his chest that he thought it might burst. He took a deep breath, turned toward the judge, and in a voice louder than anyone expected from a boy his age, he said something that made the entire courtroom gasp. The judge's gavel froze in midair. The defense lawyer's face drained of color. The accused man's smile vanished instantly. Noah had just exposed a secret that no one saw coming. And suddenly, the entire case had changed. For months earlier, Noah Harper was the happiest kid in the world. He had a mom who loved him more than anything. She always told him that kindness was the most important thing a person could have. She taught him to be strong, to never let the world turn him bitter, no matter how unfair it seemed. Always choose kindness, Noah, she would say, tucking him into bed every night. Because even when the world is cruel, kindness makes you powerful. Noah believed her. His life was simple, but he loved it. His mother, Sarah Harper, was a hardworking nurse who took care of everyone. She always brought him little treats from the hospital cafeteria and told him funny stories about her patients. Always the good ones, never the sad ones. She wanted to protect him from sadness. But sadness found them anyway. One rainy evening, Noah's mom didn't come home. At first, Noah thought maybe she got stuck at work. It had happened before. Sometimes she worked late, and his grandma, who lived just a few houses down, would come stay with him. But when an hour passed, then 2, then 3, he knew something was wrong. Then, the police knocked on the door. A detective with a serious face and kind eyes sat Noah down and told him the worst news of his life. His mom was gone. She had been attacked in the hospital parking lot, and they were still looking for who did it. Noah's world fell apart. Nothing made sense anymore. The woman who tucked him in at night, who made him peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with the crust cut off, who danced with him in the kitchen while making breakfast, she was gone. They said it was a robbery gone wrong. Someone had taken her purse, her car keys, and left her there. But deep down, Noah felt something wasn't right. His mom had always told him to trust his instincts. And his instincts screamed that this wasn't just a random crime. But who would want to hurt her? She was the kindest person in the world. For weeks, Noah barely spoke. He barely ate. His grandma moved in with him, trying her best to take care of him, but nothing felt the same. His house felt empty. His heart felt like a cracked egg, fragile and broken. Then, one day, the police arrested a man. His name was Martin Graves, a well-known businessman in town. Noah didn't know much about him, but the police said they had enough evidence to charge him. People whispered about it everywhere. Some believed he was guilty. Others thought he was innocent. The trial began, and the world watched as Martin's expensive lawyers poked holes in the case. And Noah? He watched too. He sat in that courtroom every single day, staring at the man who had turned his life into a nightmare. The lawyers kept saying there wasn't enough proof, that it was all just a coincidence, that Martin was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Noah clenched his fists. He felt helpless. He was just a kid. What could he do? Then, one night, he found something that would change everything. And as he stood in the courtroom, staring at Martin Graves, he knew exactly what he had to do. "Your Honor," Noah said, his voice steady despite the tears burning behind his eyes. The whole room turned toward him. The judge's expression softened, but the tension in the courtroom grew thick. "I know he did it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Martin shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. His lawyer stood up, ready to object, but the judge held up a hand. "Noah," the judge said gently, "what do you mean?" Noah took a deep breath. "I can prove it," he said. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, people shifting in their seats. Noah had their attention now, and he wasn't going to let them look away. The courtroom buzzed with confusion. The judge tapped his gavel once, calling for silence, but the murmurs refused to die down. Everyone was staring at Noah. An 8-year-old boy had just claimed he could prove Martin Graves was guilty, something the prosecution had struggled to do for weeks. "Noah," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. "This is a serious claim. What proof do you have?" Noah's heart pounded in his chest. He clutched the tiny object in his pocket, the thing that had kept him awake every night since he found it. Martin Graves shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since the trial started, the smug look on his face disappeared. Noah took a shaky breath, then slowly pulled his hand from his pocket. His fingers trembled as he held up a single silver button. The courtroom fell silent. "A button? That's it." People started whispering again. Even the defense attorney looked relieved. He smirked and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a grieving child." But Noah interrupted him. "This isn't just any button." His voice was steady now. Strong. The judge studied the button carefully. "Explain, Noah." Noah glanced at Martin, who was gripping the arms of his chair now, his knuckles turning white. Noah's stomach twisted, but he pushed forward. "I found this in my mom's car." His voice wavered for a second, but he swallowed the lump in his throat. It was stuck in the back seat, between the cushions. The courtroom went dead silent again. Martin Graves stiffened. The defense attorney scoffed. "That means nothing. Anyone could have dropped a button in that car." Noah clenched his fists. "Not this button," he said. "I looked it up. It belongs to a very specific kind of suit. A suit that costs a lot of money." He turned to the jury, his voice rising. "And Mr. Graves wears this exact suit." Gasps rippled through the room. The judge leaned forward, examining the button more closely. The prosecutor quickly grabbed a file from his desk, flipping through photos of Martin Graves taken at business events. Then he froze. He slowly lifted a picture for the court to see. A recent photo of Martin Graves in a sleek navy suit, missing a single silver button on his left sleeve. The exact button Noah was holding. The entire room exploded with noise. Martin Graves jumped to his feet. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his face red with panic. "A button doesn't mean anything." But the prosecutor was already speaking. "Your Honor, we need to reopen the investigation. If this button was in Ms. Harper's car, it places Mr. Graves at the crime scene." The judge nodded. "Agreed." Martin's lawyer tried to protest, but no one was listening anymore. All eyes were on Noah, the boy who had just changed the entire case with one tiny piece of evidence. Noah felt his legs shaking beneath him. He had done it. He had proved it. But as he sat down, his grandma squeezing his hand, he noticed something. Martin Graves wasn't looking at the judge anymore. He wasn't even looking at his lawyer. He was looking at Noah, and the look in his eyes sent a chill down Noah's spine. Because for the first time, Noah realized Martin wasn't just angry. He was afraid. And that meant Noah was in danger. The night before Noah testified, he had trouble sleeping. The trial had been dragging on for weeks, and he hated sitting in that courtroom, listening to people argue about his mom like she was just another case. She wasn't a case. She was his mom. His grandma tried her best to take care of him. She made his favorite meals, let him stay up late to watch cartoons, and even let him sleep in her room when he felt scared. But nothing made the nightmares go away. That night, he had woken up in a cold sweat, the image of his mom's empty car flashing through his mind. He had never been allowed to see it after the crime, but something told him there was more to it than what the police had found. So, the next morning, when his grandma went to the grocery store, Noah made a decision. He was going to find out for himself. He grabbed his bike and rode all the way to the police impound lot. It wasn't that far, but he had never gone there alone before. His heart pounded as he walked up to the fence. The lot was mostly empty, except for a few old cars waiting to be processed. Then he saw it. His mom's car. It was covered in dust, and the windows were still broken. His stomach twisted just looking at it. But he had to do this. Checking to make sure no one was watching, he slipped under the fence. He ran straight to the car and pulled open the back door. The seats were stained with dirt, and some of his mom's things were still inside. A coffee cup, an old scarf, a book she had been reading. That's when he noticed something wedged deep between the seat cushions. He reached down and pulled it out. A button. A silver button. His fingers tightened around it. He didn't know why, but something about it felt important. And now, standing in the courtroom, watching Martin Graves sweat, he knew he had been right. The courtroom was still in chaos when the judge finally banged his gavel. "Order," he commanded. "This court will reconvene tomorrow with further evidence." Martin Graves was pale now, his jaw clenched tight. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at Noah. Noah felt his grandma's arm wrap around him, pulling him close. "You were amazing, sweetheart," she whispered. "Your mom would be so proud." Noah wanted to believe that. But as he glanced toward Martin Graves one last time, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Because something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. That night, Noah couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Martin Graves staring at him from across the courtroom. That look, cold, calculating, dangerous, was burned into his brain. He tossed and turned, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. His grandma had let him sleep in her bed again, just like she always did when he had nightmares. She ran her fingers through his hair, humming softly, the way his mom used to. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was. Noah knew that proving Martin Graves was guilty wouldn't bring his mom back. But he also knew that if he didn't do this, if he didn't fight for her, no one else would. The trial was supposed to continue tomorrow. The judge had agreed to let the prosecution bring in more evidence now that they had the button. But deep down, Noah had a terrible feeling that Martin wasn't going to just sit back and let that happen. And he was right. Because the next morning, something terrifying happened. Noah woke up to the sound of his grandma's voice. Except it wasn't her normal voice. She sounded panicked. "Noah, wake up," she whispered, shaking him gently. Noah blinked, still half asleep. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer. Instead, she held up a piece of paper. Her hands were shaking as she unfolded it and showed it to him. Noah's blood turned to ice. It was a note, and it only had 5 words. "Drop the case, or else." His stomach clenched. He looked up at his grandma. Where did you find this?" She swallowed hard. "It was taped to our front door this morning." Noah sat up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. Someone had been outside their house. Someone had been close enough to leave this note. And there was no doubt in his mind who it was from. Martin Graves. His hands curled into fists. He knew Martin was scared now. And scared people did desperate things. But Noah wasn't going to back down. By the time they got to the courthouse, the police were already investigating the threat. The prosecutor, Mr. Lawson, looked furious. "This is witness intimidation," he told the judge. "We need to put Martin Graves into custody immediately." Martin's lawyer scoffed. "You have no proof that my client had anything to do with this." Martin Graves just sat there, cool and collected, like nothing was happening. But Noah noticed something. His hands. They were gripping the arms of his chair so tight his knuckles had turned white. That was the only sign that he was nervous. The judge sighed heavily. "We will take this threat seriously, but we need solid evidence before we can make an arrest. Let's proceed with the trial." Noah clenched his fists. Evidence. That's what they needed. More proof. And suddenly, he had an idea. A crazy, risky idea. Later that afternoon, after the courtroom had cleared out for the day, Noah sat in his grandma's car, deep in thought. The button had shaken Martin. That much was clear. But it wasn't enough to convict him. They needed something stronger. Something undeniable. Something that tied him directly to the crime. That's when he remembered something. His mom's car had a dash cam. Noah's eyes widened. Had anyone checked the footage? His heart started racing. The car had been sitting in the impound lot for months. What if the camera still had something recorded on it? He had to find out. "Grandma," he said quickly, "can we go back to the police station?" She frowned. "Why, sweetheart?" He hesitated for a second. He didn't want to get her worried. But this was important. "I think I know where we can find more evidence," he said. Her eyes searched his face, then softened. She nodded. "Okay." Back at the police station, Noah explained his theory to the detective in charge of the case. At first, the man looked skeptical. "The dashcam?" he asked. "The car was pretty badly damaged when we found it. If there was a camera, it might not have survived." Noah felt his stomach sink. But then, "Wait," the detective said suddenly. "Now that you mention it, I do remember seeing a small camera mounted on the windshield." Noah sat up straight. "Did anyone check it?" The detective frowned. "I don't think so. We were focused on other evidence at the time." "Can we check it now?" Noah asked quickly. The detective hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Let's go." They drove back to the impound lot, and Noah's heart pounded as they approached his mom's car. It looked just as broken as before. The windows were cracked, the seats covered in dust. The detective climbed into the driver's seat and reached for the small black device mounted near the mirror. It was dusty, but still intact. And then, "Oh my God," the detective whispered. "What?" Noah asked, barely breathing. The detective turned the camera toward them. The small red light was still blinking. It was still on. Noah's heart nearly exploded. That meant the footage was still inside. And that meant they might have caught the killer on camera. The detective held the dash cam in his hands like it was made of gold. Noah's breath caught in his throat. "Does it still work?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The detective examined it, flipping it over in his hands. "It looks like the memory card is still inside," he said. "But we won't know if it has footage until we plug it in." Noah's fingers curled into fists. This was it. If the camera had recorded anything from the night his mom was taken from him, then they had the proof they needed. The detective turned to him. "Come on, let's take this back to the station." Noah didn't wait to be told twice. He and his grandma followed the detective, their hearts pounding with every step. Back at the police station, the detective plugged the memory card into his computer. The room was silent. Noah held his breath as the screen flickered to life. A series of videos appeared on the screen. Some were from weeks before, showing his mom driving around town, running errands, humming softly to herself. It was both comforting and painful to see her again. Then, the detective clicked on the last video, the one from the night of the attack. The screen went dark for a second. Then, the parking lot. It was blurry, the camera tilted slightly, but they could see the dim glow of the hospital's security lights. His mom's car was parked near the back, away from the other vehicles. She had probably been getting something from the back seat. Then, movement. Noah's breath hitched. A shadow. A figure approaching from behind. His mom turned around, startled. The video had no sound, but Noah could almost hear her voice in his head, probably asking, "Can I help you?" the way she always did. The man stepped closer. He was tall, broad shoulders, dark clothing. And then, the moment that made Noah's skin go ice cold. The man raised his hand. Something metallic flashed. A knife. Noah's stomach churned. The next part happened so fast. His mom stepped back, alarmed. But the man lunged forward, grabbing her. She struggled, but he was too strong. Then, the worst part. The man turned his face toward the camera, just for a second. But it was enough. Noah gasped. His grandma covered her mouth. And the detective cursed under his breath. Because the man on the screen was Martin Graves. The room was silent for a long time. The detective replayed the clip 3 times just to be sure. But there was no doubt. Martin Graves had been caught on camera. Noah felt like he couldn't breathe. He had been waiting for this moment for months. For proof. For justice. And now it was right in front of them. His grandma reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. "We have to show this to the judge," she whispered. The detective nodded. "I'm calling the prosecutor right now." He reached for his phone, dialing furiously. Noah exhaled, his whole body shaking. It was finally happening. Martin Graves wasn't going to get away with this. But then, a sudden crash echoed from outside. Noah jumped. The detective's head snapped up. Another crash. Then, gunshots. Noah's grandma gasped, pulling him close. "Get down," the detective ordered, reaching for his gun. Noah's heart was in his throat. What was happening? The sound of shouting filled the hallway. The detective moved toward the door, peeking out carefully. His face darkened. Then, he turned back to Noah and his grandma. "You both need to stay here. Don't move." Noah could barely nod before the detective slipped out the door, gun drawn. His grandma hugged him tight. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. But Noah wasn't so sure. Because deep down he knew. Martin Graves had just made his move. Outside, chaos erupted. Officers were running in every direction, their radios crackling with urgent commands. The front entrance of the police station had been smashed, glass shattered across the floor. A black car sped away, its tires screeching against the pavement. Inside, Noah and his grandma stayed hidden in the small office, their backs pressed against the desk. Noah's heart wouldn't slow down. Was Martin trying to destroy the evidence? Was he trying to silence them? The detective returned a few minutes later, his face grim. Someone just attacked the station. They shot out the security cameras and tried to break into the evidence room. Noah's blood ran cold. "Did they take anything?" his grandma asked, her voice shaking. The detective shook his head. "No, but they tried." He glanced at the computer, where the footage was still paused on Martin Graves' face. "And I think we know why." Noah swallowed hard. Martin knew. He knew they had proof. And now, he was more dangerous than ever. Back at home, Noah couldn't sit still. He felt like a storm was raging inside him. His grandma had locked every door and window, double-checking them 3 times. "The police are watching the house," she assured him. "We're safe." But Noah wasn't so sure, because Martin wasn't the type to just sit back and wait to be arrested. And Noah had a terrible feeling that he wasn't finished yet. Later that night, long after his grandma had fallen asleep, Noah sat awake in bed. The room was dark, but his mind was racing. He thought about his mom, about what she would do if she were here. She wouldn't hide. She wouldn't run. She would fight. And so would he. That's when he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would take the stand again. He would tell the whole courtroom what he had seen. And this time, Martin Graves wouldn't be able to lie his way out of it. Noah closed his eyes, trying to ignore the fear creeping up his spine. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. And if Martin had already tried to silence them once, then he was going to try again. The next morning, Noah woke up with a knot in his stomach. Today was the day. Today, he would take the stand and show the world what was on that video. But as he sat at the breakfast table, pushing his cereal around with his spoon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His grandma sat across from him, trying to act normal. "You don't have to do this if you're scared, sweetheart," she said gently. "The police already have the footage. They can use it without you testifying." Noah shook his head. "No, I have to do this." His mom always told him that courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about doing what was right, even when you were scared. And Noah was terrified. But he was ready. Or so he thought. Because just as they were about to leave for court, the phone rang. His grandma answered, her voice cheerful. "Hello." Then, she froze. Noah watched as her face drained of color, her hands gripping the phone so tight her knuckles turned white. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't." Then, she hung up. "Noah," she said, turning to him, her voice shaky. "Get your things. We have to go now." "What? What's happening?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed the car keys and rushed toward the door, pulling him along. Noah barely had time to grab his backpack before she shoved him into the car and locked the doors. As they sped down the street, his heart pounded. "Grandma, what's wrong?" She gripped the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "That was the police," she finally said. "They just found out something." Noah leaned forward. "What?" She took a deep breath. "Martin Graves made bail." Noah's stomach dropped. "No," he whispered. "Oh no." That meant he was out. Free. And Noah knew exactly what that meant. He was coming for them. By the time they reached the courthouse, the place was already swarming with reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in their faces. "Noah, how do you feel about today's testimony? Do you think Martin Graves is coming after you? Are you afraid?" Noah clenched his fists. Yes, he was afraid. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. His grandma wrapped an arm around him, shielding him from the chaos. The police quickly escorted them inside, where the prosecutor, Mr. Lawson, was waiting. He looked stressed. "Where is he?" Noah asked immediately. Mr. Lawson sighed. "His lawyers got him out on bail last night. He hasn't shown up to court yet, but he's supposed to." Noah swallowed hard. "And if he doesn't? Then he's officially on the run." A chill ran down Noah's spine. Martin Graves wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let himself be arrested. If he was out on bail, then he was planning something. Something bad. The trial started, and Noah was called to the stand. He had never been in a place so silent before. The whole courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The prosecutor stood in front of him, smiling reassuringly. "Noah, I know this is scary, but can you tell the court what you saw on the dashcam footage?" Noah took a deep breath. Then, in a strong, clear voice, he told them everything. How his mom had been attacked. How Martin Graves had been caught on video. How he had tried to destroy the evidence. The jury hung onto every word. Even the judge looked shaken. And then, Mr. Lawson turned to the screen. "Your Honor, I would like to submit the dashcam footage as evidence." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The lights dimmed. The screen flickered on. The entire courtroom watched as the video played. Gasps filled the room. People covered their mouths. The jury whispered to one another. There was Martin Graves, clear as day, attacking Noah's mom. The defense lawyer tried to object, but it was useless now. The truth was out. Noah's heart raced. It was over. They had won. But then, a loud bang echoed through the courthouse, and everything turned to chaos. Screams erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor. People ducked, some running for cover. Noah's grandma grabbed him, pulling him close. Get down. The courtroom doors burst open. Police officers flooded in, their guns drawn. And at the center of the chaos, Martin Graves. He was standing near the back of the courtroom, his face twisted with rage. He had come, and he wasn't alone. Two men stood beside him, blocking the doors. We need to move, one of the officers shouted. Noah felt his grandma pulling him toward a side exit. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might explode. This wasn't just about the trial anymore. This was about survival. And Martin Graves wasn't going to leave quietly. The courtroom was a storm of chaos. The sound of screams and shuffling feet filled the air as people tried to run for safety. The security guards yelled commands, drawing their weapons, but Martin Graves wasn't moving. He stood there, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his dark eyes scanning the room, searching for Noah. Noah's blood ran cold. Move now, an officer shouted, pushing people toward the side exits. Noah felt his grandma's grip tighten around his wrist as she pulled him toward the door. But before they could reach it, Martin Graves took a step forward. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. Noah Harper. Noah froze. The entire room seemed to stop. The reporters, the jury, the judge, everyone turned their heads. Martin's eyes locked onto him. And then he smiled. A slow, chilling smile. I just want to talk, he said. Liar. Noah's heart pounded so hard it hurt. He knew that voice, that fake calmness. He had heard men like Martin before. Men who pretended to be in control even when they were losing. Martin Graves was losing. And losing men were dangerous. Go now, Mr. Lawson hissed, grabbing Noah's other arm and pulling him toward the back exit. That's when the first gunshot rang out. Bang! Glass shattered. A light bulb burst overhead. More screams. The security guards tackled Martin's men, pinning them to the ground, but Martin was still standing, still smiling. And in his hand, a gun. Noah's breath caught in his throat. Martin had come prepared. Noah felt his feet moving before his brain even caught up. He ran. His grandma was right behind him, and Mr. Lawson shoved open the door, pushing them through. They raced down a narrow hallway, their footsteps echoing. Another gunshot. This one was closer. Noah didn't dare look back. They reached the emergency stairwell. An officer was waiting there, yelling at them to keep moving. This way, the officer shouted, leading them down the stairs. Noah ran so fast he nearly tripped, but Mr. Lawson grabbed him, keeping him steady. They burst out the back exit of the courthouse. Cold air hit Noah's face. Police cars were everywhere, lights flashing. Officers were swarming the building. But Martin was still inside, still hunting him. Noah was rushed into a police car, his grandma right beside him. Mr. Lawson slammed the door shut behind them, barking orders at the officers outside. The car sped away. Noah looked out the window, his chest heaving. The courthouse was growing smaller in the distance. But something told him this wasn't over. Not yet. An hour later, they were taken to a safe house. It was a small cabin in the woods, far from town. Noah's grandma sat on the couch, holding his hand. The detective, the prosecutor, and two armed officers stood nearby, discussing their next steps. They'll catch him, Mr. Lawson said, his voice firm. Noah nodded, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. Martin Graves wasn't just some criminal. He was a man who had built his whole life on being untouchable. And men like that didn't go down without a fight. That night, Noah sat by the window, staring into the darkness outside. The trees swayed in the wind. The moon cast eerie shadows over the yard. He should have felt safe. He didn't. His grandma had fallen asleep on the couch, and the officers stood watch outside. But Noah couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Martin wasn't finished yet. He was still out there, watching, waiting. And Noah Harper was his target. The night was too quiet. Noah sat by the window of the safe house, staring into the darkness. The wind howled through the trees, making the shadows outside dance like ghosts. The officers stood guard outside, their hands on their weapons, scanning the area. Noah should have felt safe, but he didn't. His gut told him something wasn't right. His grandma had finally fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the chaos of the day. Mr. Lawson and the detective were still awake, whispering about the next steps. Martin Graves won't stay hidden for long, Mr. Lawson said. He's desperate. We need to find him before he finds us. Noah swallowed hard. Martin was out there. And Noah knew. He was coming. Hours passed. The officers outside switched shifts. The detective went into the other room to make calls. Mr. Lawson dozed off in a chair. Noah was still awake. His eyes flickered between the officers at the front and back doors. The men were alert, gripping their guns tightly. But something was wrong. Then, a movement. A shadow. Noah's breath caught in his throat. At first, he thought he was imagining it. The trees were swaying. The moonlight played tricks on the ground. But then, he saw it again. A figure, moving between the trees. Noah's pulse skyrocketed. His fingers dug into the windowsill. Then, another figure. No, two more figures. His stomach twisted. Martin Graves wasn't alone. Noah turned, heart pounding. Mr. Lawson, he whispered. The prosecutor stirred, rubbing his eyes. What's wrong? Noah pointed out the window. They're here. Mr. Lawson stiffened. He jumped up and rushed to the window, his eyes scanning the tree-line. Then he saw it too. He cursed under his breath and grabbed his phone. The officers outside hadn't noticed yet. The intruders were moving too carefully. They're sneaking in, Noah whispered. Mr. Lawson didn't waste time. He pressed a button on his phone. We have movement outside. Lock the place down now. Suddenly, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness. Noah's breath hitched. A second later, gunfire. Shouting erupted outside. The officers scrambled, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Noah grabbed his grandma's arm. She jolted awake, confused. Noah, what? Get down. He pulled her to the floor, just as a bullet shattered the window. Glass rained over them. The front door burst open. Noah, go! Mr. Lawson shouted, pushing him toward the back exit. The detective rushed in from the other room, his gun drawn. They cut the power. They're coming in. Noah's grandma gripped his hand. Where do we go? The back door, the detective said. Stay low. But then, footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Coming from the back door. Noah's heart nearly stopped. Martin Graves. He had gotten inside. Noah froze. The air in the house turned thick, suffocating. Then a voice. Calm. Cold. Too close. Noah. Noah's breath came out in shaky gasps. He turned his head slowly. And there he was. Martin Graves stood at the back in trance, his dark suit rumpled, his hair slightly out of place. But his eyes were hungry. Hungry for revenge. Noah had won in the courtroom. But now, Martin was making his move. Noah clenched his fists. He wouldn't let Martin win. Not after everything he had done. The detective stepped forward, gun aimed. Don't move, Graves. Martin smiled. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. Then, before anyone could react, Martin lunged. He tackled the detective, knocking his gun away. The weapon skidded across the floor. Noah, run! Mr. Lawson yelled. Noah's grandma grabbed his wrist, yanking him toward the kitchen. But Martin wasn't after her. He wasn't even after Mr. Lawson. He only had one target. Noah. Martin's boots slammed against the floor as he chased them through the house. Noah's grandma pushed him ahead. Keep running. The house was a maze in the dark. Noah's legs burned as he sprinted toward the back pantry, a small room with an old wooden door. He dove inside, his grandma right behind him. She slammed the door shut just as Martin reached them. Bang! Martin slammed his fist against the door. Noah, his voice was slow, taunting. You really think you can hide from me? Noah squeezed his eyes shut, his heart pounding against his ribs. His grandma fumbled with her phone, trying to call for help. Noah looked around. The pantry had no windows. No way out. They were trapped. Then, Martin started laughing. Low. Dark. I told you to drop this case, he said. But you just couldn't listen, could you? Noah clenched his fists. Martin pushed against the door again, shaking it. Then, a loud crack. The door was starting to break. Noah's mind raced. They couldn't stay in here. Then, his eyes landed on the shelves. Heavy. Tall. An idea struck him like lightning. Grandma, he whispered. Help me push this. She blinked at him. What? The shelf. If we knock it down, it'll block the door. She hesitated, then nodded. Together, they shoved against the tall wooden shelves. They barely managed to move it, until Martin kicked the door. The wood splintered. He was coming in. Push, Noah shouted. With one final shove, the shelf tipped. Crash. The heavy wood slammed down, blocking the doorway completely. Silence. Noah held his breath. Then, Martin roared in frustration. You little. He pounded against the blocked door. But it wouldn't budge. For now, they were safe. But how long would it last? Noah turned to his grandma, whispering, We need to get out of here before he finds another way in. She nodded, gripping his hand tightly. Noah's pulse pounded. The fight wasn't over. But he wasn't done fighting, either. The pantry was dark. The only sound was Noah's heavy breathing and the pounding of Martin Graves' fists against the blocked door. Bang! The wood shuddered. Martin growled in frustration. Noah! His voice came through the cracks, filled with anger. You really think a shelf is going to stop me? Noah's grandma squeezed his hand. We need to get out of here, she whispered. Noah's mind raced. There was only one way out. The ceiling vent. It was small, too small for his grandma, but maybe he could fit. He turned to her. Grandma, I have an idea. She followed his gaze, and her face paled. Noah, no. It's too dangerous. It's the only way, he whispered. I can crawl through and find the police. They have to be here by now. His grandma's hands trembled. I can't let you go alone. Noah swallowed. He was scared, more scared than he had ever been. But he had to be brave. For his mom. For himself. For justice. I can do this, he whispered. His grandma hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay. Noah wasted no time. He climbed onto a lower shelf and reached for the vent. His fingers barely grasped the edges. Behind him, Martin roared again. Bang! Another piece of wood cracked. Hurry! Noah pushed, straining with everything he had, until the vent cover popped off. He took one last look at his grandma. I'll come back, he promised. Then he climbed inside. The vent was tight, the metal cold against his skin. Noah crawled as fast as he could, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, he heard the final crack. Then Martin's voice. I'm in. Noah didn't look back. He kept moving, inching forward, ignoring the pain in his elbows and knees. The vent led into a hallway. Noah could see the faint glow of light ahead. Almost there. Almost. Suddenly, the metal beneath him groaned. Then, crack. The vent snapped. Noah fell. Pain shot through his body as he crashed onto the floor. He gasped, looking around. He had landed in a dark hallway. The safe house basement. His stomach clenched. Not good. Then, footsteps. Noah scrambled up, his heart racing. Martin was close. Noah needed to hide. Now, he spotted a metal cabinet. Small, but big enough for him to squeeze inside. He dove in, shutting the door just as footsteps reached the basement stairs. Then, Martin's voice. I know you're down here, kid. Noah covered his mouth, forcing himself to stay silent. Martin's boots clicked against the floor as he walked. Slow, patient, like a hunter stalking his prey. You really think you can outsmart me, Noah? Noah squeezed his eyes shut. Please go away. Please go away. Then, the cabinet door ripped open. Light flooded in. Noah's heart stopped. Martin stood there, his dark eyes burning with rage. Noah tried to run, but Martin grabbed him, yanking him out. Gotcha! Noah kicked, punched, did everything he could, but Martin was too strong. He dragged Noah toward the stairs, gripping him tight. You should have stayed quiet, kid, he hissed. Terror shot through Noah. No, he wouldn't let Martin win. He couldn't. Then he saw it. The detective's gun. It was lying on the floor, just a few feet away. Noah lunged. Martin wasn't expecting it. He slipped, just for a second. And that was all Noah needed. He grabbed the gun. His hands shook, but he turned and pointed it at Martin. Let me go, he whispered. Martin froze. Then he laughed. You wouldn't, he taunted. Noah's grip tightened. His hands were shaking so bad, he thought he might drop the gun. But then he thought about his mom. About how she had begged for her life in that parking lot. About how Martin had smiled when he thought he had gotten away with it. Noah's fear turned to something else. Rage. He would pull the trigger. But then, freeze. A flood of officers stormed in, guns raised. Martin turned, too slow. The officers tackled him to the ground. Noah dropped the gun, his chest heaving. It was over. Martin was caught. This time for good. Noah stood frozen, his small hands trembling as the gun lay at his feet. The chaos around him blurred. Officers shouting, Martin Graves struggling beneath the weight of the men pinning him down, the sharp snap of handcuffs locking into place. It was over. Martin Graves had finally lost. Noah barely had time to process it before he felt arms wrap around him. His grandma. Oh, baby, she whispered, squeezing him so tight it almost hurt. You're safe. You're safe. Noah wanted to believe her. But deep down, something told him this wasn't over yet. An hour later, they were back at the police station. Officers moved frantically, paperwork flying across desks, phones ringing nonstop. Mr. Lawson was on the phone with the judge, demanding that Martin be denied bail this time. "He won't get out again," the detective assured Noah, kneeling in front of him. "You did it, kid. You won." Noah nodded numbly. He should have felt relieved. Instead, all he felt was empty. His mom was still gone, and nothing would ever change that. His grandma stroked his hair gently. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you home." Home. Noah wasn't sure he even knew what that word meant anymore, but he was too tired to argue. They drove back in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on him like an anchor. But just as they pulled onto their street, Noah saw something that made his stomach drop. Their front door was open, wide open. His grandma gasped, slamming on the brakes. "Noah, stay in the car." But Noah had already unbuckled his seatbelt. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The house was trashed. Drawers pulled open, furniture overturned, pictures ripped from the walls. Noah's throat went dry. Someone had been here, and they hadn't just been looking for something. They had destroyed everything. The officers who had escorted them rushed inside, their hands on their weapons. "Clear the house," one of them barked. Noah's grandma clutched his shoulders. "Stay close to me." Noah barely heard her. His eyes were scanning the mess, his mind racing. Then, he saw it. A note, sitting in the middle of the floor, placed neatly on top of the shattered remains of a family photo. 5 words. "This isn't over, little boy." Noah's blood turned to ice. He knew Martin was behind bars, but someone else was out there. Someone still wanted revenge, and they were coming for him. That night, Noah couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made his heart jump. Every shadow felt like a threat. He sat in his grandma's room, curled up in a blanket, staring at the locked door. Mr. Lawson had arranged for police to watch their house, but Noah didn't feel safe, because someone had broken in, and that meant they could do it again. His mind kept circling back to the note. Who else was involved? Who else had wanted his mom dead? Noah clenched his fists. He had come too far to back down now. If someone was still after him, then he had to find them first. Noah sat awake in the darkness, his mind racing. The note still burned in his memory. "This isn't over, little boy." Martin Graves was in jail. He was supposed to be the mastermind behind everything. But if that was true, then who had broken into their house? Who had left the note? And, more importantly, what did they want? Noah shivered. He had been fighting for justice, for the truth about his mom. But now, it felt like he was running out of time. Because someone else was playing this game, and they weren't done with him yet. The next morning, the house still smelled like dust and broken memories. Police officers moved in and out, taking photos, dusting for fingerprints. Mr. Lawson was there too, looking more exhausted than ever. "This wasn't just some random break-in," he muttered, flipping the note in his hands. Noah sat on the couch, his knees pulled to his chest. "It means someone else is involved." Mr. Lawson nodded grimly. "And they're warning you to stay quiet." Noah swallowed hard. His grandma sat beside him, rubbing his back gently. "Can't they protect us?" she asked. Mr. Lawson sighed. "We can keep officers on watch. But if this is bigger than just Martin Graves," he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Noah already knew. Martin wasn't the only villain in this story. And if Noah wanted to end this for good, he had to figure out who else was pulling the strings. Later that afternoon, Noah sat in his mom's old car, the one they had pulled from the impound lot. The same car that had held the dashcam footage. Something still wasn't adding up. He ran his fingers along the dashboard, thinking. Then, something caught his eye. A small smudge. Noah leaned closer. It wasn't just a smudge. It was a fingerprint. His heart raced. What if it belonged to whoever else was involved? He grabbed his phone and quickly snapped a picture. Then he climbed out of the car and rushed to find Mr. Lawson. When he found him, Noah shoved the phone forward. "Can they check fingerprints?" Mr. Lawson frowned at the image. "Where is this?" "The dashboard," Noah said. "Someone touched it. Someone besides my mom or Martin." Mr. Lawson's expression changed. It was a long shot, but, "We'll check," he said. And just like that, Noah had hope again. Maybe, just maybe, they were getting closer. That night, Noah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was ahead, like he was in control. But then, a noise, a soft click. Noah froze. It had come from outside his window. His heart pounded as he slowly turned his head. The blinds were closed. But there, a shadow. Noah's breath hitched. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Noah didn't move, didn't blink. Then, the shadow moved. And just like that, Noah knew. He wasn't safe. Not yet. Because they were coming. Noah's breath came in short, panicked bursts. The shadow outside his window didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Then, a slow tap. 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 Noah's heart pounded so hard it felt like his ribs might crack. He swallowed, forcing himself to move. Think, Noah. Think. He reached for his phone, his fingers shaking as he texted Mr. Lawson. Someone is outside my window. His thumb hovered over the send button. Then, the doorknob rattled. Noah's stomach twisted into knots. Whoever it was, wasn't outside anymore. They were inside the house. Noah scrambled out of bed. He grabbed his baseball bat from the corner of his room and tiptoed to the door. The hallway was dark. Silent. Too silent. His grandma's room was at the end of the hall. If he could just. A floorboard creaked. Noah's breath hitched. He turned his head just in time to see a shadow slip past the stairs. Someone was here. Inside. Looking for him. Noah's grip tightened on the bat. He had two choices, hide or fight. He thought about his mom. How she never ran from people who needed her. He wasn't going to run either. But he was going to be smart. He tiptoed back to his closet, his fingers fumbling for something. Anything. Useful. His eyes landed on a small can. Pepper spray. His mom had made him keep it when he started riding his bike alone. Just in case, she had said. He had never needed it. Until now. The floor creaked again. Closer. Noah slipped back toward the hallway, his pulse racing. The figure moved into the living room. Now or never. Noah took a deep breath, then sprinted forward. The intruder turned. But Noah was ready. He sprayed directly into their face. A loud, choking sound filled the room. The person staggered back, clutching their face, knocking into a table. A lamp crashed to the ground. Noah didn't wait. He ran to his grandma's room, shaking her awake. Grandma, someone's inside. She jolted up, panic flashing in her eyes. Then, the front door slammed open. Flashlights. Shouting. Police. The intruder tried to run, but they were tackled to the ground before they could even reach the door. Noah gasped for air, his whole body shaking. It was over. Finally over. The next morning, Noah sat at the police station. Mr. Lawson placed a file on the table in front of him. We got the fingerprints back, he said. Noah's heart pounded. Who was it? He whispered. Mr. Lawson hesitated. Then, he slid a photo across the table. Noah's eyes widened. It wasn't just Martin Graves. It was someone else. Someone Noah never expected. A person he had trusted. A person he knew. Noah's stomach twisted. Because the second he saw the name, he realized the truth. This wasn't just Martin's crime. It was bigger. And now, Noah was the only one who knew. Noah stared at the name on the file, his hands trembling. The air in the police station felt heavy, crushing. It wasn't just Martin Graves. It was Detective Cole Walker, the very detective who had been assigned to his mom's case. The man who had sat with him, comforted him, told him they were doing everything to find the killer. Noah's stomach twisted. He looked up at Mr. Lawson, his throat dry. I don't understand. Mr. Lawson sighed. We didn't either. Until we checked the financial records. He flipped open the file, showing page after page of documents. Walker was working with Graves, Mr. Lawson explained. He was paid to cover up the evidence, to make sure the case never went anywhere. Noah clenched his fists. So, when he told me they were doing everything to find the killer, he was lying, Mr. Lawson confirmed. Noah felt sick. All this time, all the nights he had spent feeling helpless, thinking the police were trying their best, and one of them had been working against him, against his mom, against the truth. Noah swallowed the anger burning in his chest. Is he arrested? Mr. Lawson nodded. After last night, yes. The break-in was the final proof we needed. He was desperate to get rid of you before you could figure it out. Noah exhaled slowly. He had won. The real fight was over. A week later, Noah stood in the cemetery, a bouquet of his mom's favorite flowers in his hands. The trial had ended. Martin Graves and Cole Walker had been sentenced to life in prison. No bail. No second chances. Justice. Noah kneeled by his mom's headstone, placing the flowers gently on the ground. Hi, Mom, he whispered. I did it. The wind blew softly, rustling the trees. Noah smiled a little. It still hurt. It always would. But he had done what his mom always taught him to do. He had fought for what was right. And because of that, he won. He stood up, feeling lighter than he had in months. As he walked back toward his grandma, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just the kid who lost his mom anymore. He was the kid who got justice. The kid who never gave up. The The kid who outsmarted the killers.